Before we get to Turkey and Iran and Israel currently, I wanted to go back in time. President Obama has gone down to Mississippi, and he's going to be in the Gulf Coast for a few days. But there's very little discussed about BP's history. And I'm wondering if you could start with us there.
The history of the company we now call BP over the last 100 years has really traced the arc of global transnational capitalism. This company began as a kind of a wildcatting operation in Iran back in the first decade of the 20th century. It was very entrepreneurial and risk-taking, and they had a bunch of geologists running around in these very forbidding steppes and deserts, and finally they struck what was the greatest find up to that time in the history of the oil industry. They were the ones who discovered that Iran was sitting on an ocean of oil, and then they decided they would take it under a corrupt deal that they had struck with a few representatives of the old declining Iranian monarchy, all of whom had been paid off by the company. This concession, which later became known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, guaranteed itself, or won the right to, own all of Iran's oil. So nobody in Iran had any right to drill for oil or extract oil or sell oil. Then, soon after that find was made, the British government decided to buy the company. So the Parliament passed a law and bought 51% of that company. And all during the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the entire standard of living that people in England enjoyed was supported by oil from Iran. All the trucks and jeeps in Britain were being run on Iran oil. Factories all over Britain were being fueled by oil from Iran. The Royal Navy, which projected British power all over the world, was run 100% on oil from Iran. So that became a fundamental foundation of British life. And then, after World War II, when the winds of nationalism and anti-colonialism were blowing throughout the developing world, Iranians developed this idea, we've got to take our oil back. And that was the kind of national passion that brought to power Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the most prominent figure in the democratic period of Iran during the late 40s and early 50s. It was Mossadegh's desire, supported by a unanimous vote of the democratically elected parliament of Iran, to nationalize what was then the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They carried out the nationalization. The British and their partners in the United States fiercely resisted this, and when they were unable to prevent it from happening, they organized the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. So that overthrow not only produced the end of the Mossadegh government, but the end of democracy in Iran. And that set off all these other following consequences. The Shah ruled for 25 years with increasing repression. His rule produced the explosion of the late 70s. It produced the Islamic regime. So it was to protect the interests of the oil company we now know as BP that the CIA and the British Secret Service joined together to overthrow the democratic government in Iran and produce all the consequences we've seen in Iran over the last half-century.
And that involved both Dulles brothers. People often fly into Dulles Airport. John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and also Teddy Roosevelt's grandson.
Yeah, history is kind of winking at us from that episode. It's quite an interesting quirk that Theodore Roosevelt, who essentially brought the United States into the regime change era around the very beginning of the 20th century, wound up having a grandson who began the modern age of intervention. Bear in mind that Iran was the first country where the CIA went in to overthrow a government. When Teddy Roosevelt was overthrowing governments, there was no CIA. So each of them opened a chapter in the history of American interventionism.
And why, before we move forward now, why did the U.S. intervene on behalf of a British company, what later became British Petroleum, or BP?
There were several reasons for it. Part of it had to do with the desire for transatlantic solidarity, but I really think there were two key reasons. One was that the Americans persuaded themselves that they had to fight communism somewhere in the world. That was the idea with which Dulles and Eisenhower came into power in 1953, that they would no longer stick with the strategy of containment of communism, but they were going to a new strategy of rollback. But once they got into power, they were thinking, how are we going to roll back communism? We can't invade the Soviet Union. We're not going to bomb China. And here's where the other piece came in. The British were very eager to overthrow Mossadegh in order to get back their oil company. But when they presented the plan to Dulles and Eisenhower, the agent who they sent to Washington, who has later written his memoirs, did something very clever. He decided, it's not going to work if I tell the Americans, please overthrow Mossadegh so we can have our oil company back. The Americans won't respond to that. They won't care enough. They'll be afraid of the precedent of a government taking over a corporation that produces a resource in a poor country. That's a bad precedent for John Foster Dulles and Americans, just as much as it is for the British. But what the Americans are really concerned about at this moment in the early 50s is communism. So let's tell them that Mossadegh is leading Iran toward communism. Now, Mossadegh was an elderly aristocrat who despised all socialist and Marxist ideas, but that was just a detail. He was able to be portrayed as a person who was weak enough so that later on his fall might produce an attempt by communists to take over in Iran. So it was this combination of wanting to make sure that the example was not given in the world, that nationalist governments could just nationalize companies owned by rich countries, and secondly, anybody who could come into the American scope as being possibly not even sympathetic to communism, but creating a situation in which after he was gone, there might be instability that could lead to a communist government, would wind up being a target of the U.S.
Well, Stephen Keinszer, we're going to come forward. Your theory, what the thesis you're putting forward in Reset is that there could be a strategic alliance, a new power triangle between the United States, Iran, and Turkey. Explain the histories of these countries that makes you believe this and where the U.S. could engage with them today.
I start out from the principle that our policy toward the Middle East is really stuck in a vanished era. Our policies may or may not have made sense during the Cold War, but the Cold War has been over for more than 20 years. The strategic environment in the Middle East has changed tremendously. New threats to American and Western interests have emerged there, and new opportunities have also emerged there. But our policy is still stuck in a former era. We're trying to deal with problems that don't even exist anymore. We're way back in time. We need to be looking forward into the 21st century and figuring out, how do we want to conform our policies toward the Middle East in a way that will be beneficial to us and produce the result that in the long run is going to be good for the United States in the Middle East, which is stability. The policies we've followed up to now have manifestly failed to do that. During all this period that the U.S. has been a dominant force in the Middle East, we have wound up producing a region that is a pit of violence and hatred and terror and war. So we're in a situation like Einstein referred to, I think, when he defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. That's what we're doing in the Middle East. So I start from this premise that we need to think big. We need to break out of this very narrow spectrum of acceptable opinions and try to think in a more creative, original